this is one of the most expensive forms of decarbonization. If that's the most important thing to you, the train doesn't do it. We will bankrupt ourselves if we think that, we can pay this much for decarbonization. My concern is that we're pushing people into these projects that are very expensive. If we have this ambition to decarbonize, it just feels to me like we can do a lot of other things that would be much more capital efficient and less burdensome on our total economy.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of PowerGab, your go-to show for all things energy and environmental policy in the state of Colorado. I'm Jake Fogleman, joined as always by my co-host, Amy Cooke. And this week we have with us a very special guest. He is the Director of Energy Additions at Liberty Energy, Ryan Zorn. Welcome to PowerGab.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, Liberty, before we jump into the crux of what we want to talk about today, Liberty obviously has been in the news quite a bit lately because CEO Chris Wright was tapped by President-elect Trump to be the head of the Department of Energy. We're just curious, before we jump into what we want to talk about, how has that been for you folks over at Liberty since that announcement was made?
Well, yeah, I don't know if anybody had it on their bingo cards to start 2024, but in the late spring and early summer, it obviously became a possibility, and you didn't know how remote that might be. But obviously, as certain things happened throughout the fall, it all fell into place. And so, yeah, Chris will be leaving us for hopefully a short time. But we're all excited for him, probably a little terrified as well for him too. He's a serial entrepreneur. Obviously has had to be more involved in government than maybe he ever expected over the last few years, just being a Colorado-based traditional energy company, and all that has brought with it. It's comforting to people like me, at least, just speaking personally, just the amount of private sector folks that are going to be involved in this new administration, and they were announced, pretty quickly after the election. And so I think that's a pretty encouraging sign, and it's going to be a huge challenge. It's obviously a totally different environment than what Chris has created at Liberty. And so we're all excited to see what he can do with that organization, which involves a lot of other things besides just, what people normally think is energy. But, they have responsibility for the oversight of nuclear programs of every variety, including warheads. And so, there's a lot of new stuff for Chris to sink his teeth into as well, which I know he's excited for.
I'm going to throw out what I think is going to be the hardest thing for him. He's not a guy who wears suits, and DC is a suit place.
Yes, it is.
The land of the black SUV and the, Brooks Brothers suit and the power tie. And Chris is, from what I know of him, is a hiking boots, hiking pants, maybe a collared shirt with I'll say it, a North Face vest.
It's definitely not North Face, but yeah, it's funny. Like, I think it was the New York Times wrote which I think we would consider a hit piece, where he says he's often photographed wearing a fleece vest, and I'm like, well, that's because that's what he wears,
Yeah,
But,
all the time. And anybody who's known him, that's exactly what he wears. One of the things you said, Ryan, and we'll get into what we want to talk about today, and what you and I had a brief conversation about, talking about the decline in production in Colorado, and something that Chris has had to deal with the increased regulations within the state of Colorado. And how does an oil and gas development company, that, by the way, really is also an environmentalist, conservationist approach to oil and gas development, how do they navigate that? And one of the things we've certainly seen with the last two administrations with Jared Polis is a decline in oil and gas production. in the state of Colorado, and really what that's led to. And I'm gonna tease the audience with this, and then let you take off with it. You said for instance, the state of Colorado, they came for the producers. Now they're coming for consumers, if I have that correct. So first they came for producers, now they're coming for consumers, and we're seeing that play out. Walk us through production, from how they went from going after producers to the impact on consumers. And we have some great slides that you have developed that we'll drop in to that viewers will see on the screen.
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, this whole of government approach has been present in our federal government for sure in this current administration, but it's been present in our state government for even longer. And they certainly first focused in the first legislative session when, after Jared Polis was elected, and they flipped the Senate, so they controlled everything. And that kicked off a series of legislation in the spring of 2019, which kicked off many years of rulemakings that are still going on. It's been very challenging, especially for small producers, to deal with. And it's created a lot of consolidation or reasons to consolidate. And so now you basically have three major producers in our DJ Basin, Denver-Julesburg Basin in northeastern Colorado, which has been the workhorse for production growth, in particular for our state, prior to 2019. And the slide that we're probably showing now is really a depiction of that, where Colorado oil and gas production was keeping pace with the rest of the onshore U.S. prior to this administration and one-party control and the policy actions that they've taken. To the point now where, we had some temporary declines across the U.S. during COVID, but you can see that blue line really picked up steam as soon as we came out of COVID. Well, Colorado did not, partly because it had chased the capital away and people had other places to invest money. And that's resulted in lower production almost by 30% relative to the rest of the U.S. And that's a real tragedy, because the value of that missed production opportunity here now totals, if you just basically multiply missed volumes by benchmark prices, now we're almost $18 billion that the state has missed in revenue. And by the way, all the things that this administration wants to fund is, as we'll see in a second, based on severance and ad valorem taxes. Most of that goes back to local governments and library districts and school districts, fire protection districts that are serving the communities where oil and gas is produced. But there's a certain amount of that severance and ad valorem, and severance in particular, that gets distributed in various programs around the state.
Can I ask, I just want to clarify something, Ryan.
Yeah.
You said we have two things, actually. Producers have consolidated down to three major players in the DJ Basin. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have Chevron, Oxy, and Civitas.
That's
effectively. I mean, that's really, the most of that basin's production is associated with those three producers.
You think about how
all
many
very quality companies, but there's been a lot of consolidation that's created their footprint today.
And because part of that is they can absorb the regulatory costs where smaller producers cannot. So smaller producers have either been bought out or pushed out. The other thing I wanted is, you said $18 billion in missed revenue?
Yeah, and that's just my estimation.
Okay.
Basically, had that red line continued to match the blue line, we would have had an extra almost $18 billion, $17.5 billion over this time frame to fund various things in our state.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's continue, because this is important stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple examples of, something that severance tax funds is some of the Department of Local Affairs grant money. And, especially in mountain communities, where along the Front Range too, but mountain communities in particular have really been hit hard post-COVID on housing affordability. And so this is a closer look based upon one mountain community's study of a affordable housing project they desperately need. But in order to get DOLA money, they felt some pressure that they needed to, consider a pretty exotic energy system that was going to serve those residents. And so they hired a consultant, of course, who submitted a report to the town council trustees that compared a traditional gas boiler and electric service to a ground source heat pump, an all electric system, essentially. And, for our economic system that's going to fund these things, it's a 50% premium. It's $1.5 million more for this more exotic energy system. Now, from the town's perspective, after all the subsidies flow into them, both federal and state, it's actually cheaper net to them. And so it's this polluted set of conditions that people are making decisions on, and the other irony for me when I dug into this a bit was when you consider the current rate of our power grid's decarbonization, just continue that trend. And last year, the carbon intensity of our state's power grid declined by like 7.3%. Now, if you just make the assumption that you continue that in perpetuity, this exotic geothermal system will save you some carbon emissions, but at what cost? And for $1.5 million more in cost that is borne by taxpayers primarily, that avoided cost of carbon is almost $4,000 a ton. And if you assume like a much more radical and very aspirational decarbonization pace that gets you to 100% renewable by 2030, and that's not the state's goal. I think they're still 2040. But we do have some ski areas that have put out sustainability reports in the state where they think they can get to 100% by 2030. So let's just take that as a boundary sort of condition, which is, I don't think, based on anything physical. But if we did achieve that sort of pace, the cost of carbon avoided drops down to just over $1,600 a ton. But both of those numbers are well in excess of any sort of market-based price of carbon. And I've compared that to what we've seen this year in California, which is $39 a ton. And so my concern is that we're pushing people into these projects that are very expensive. If we have this ambition to decarbonize, it just feels to me like we can do a lot of other things that would be much more capital efficient and less burdensome on our total economy.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but one thing that stuck out to me in this slide, and this sort of model example of just one particular town, as you pointed out, this is going on in towns across the state, is the choice to opt for specifically higher cost, as you call them, exotic options, because there's a fiscal incentive, because the state or the feds are providing a fiscal incentive to spend more, to buy more than is necessary in order to attract the most amount of public dollars. So like a ground source heat pump, for example, you can get like you said, a gas boiler or even an air source heat pump for much cheaper, but because they're being juiced by deliberate policy choices, it seems to create like a really bad perverse incentive to overspend.
Yeah, that's right. They're just, and again, our economy absorbs that burden, or is being forced to absorb that. It's not like it's just funded by something that falls out of the ether, right? These are taxpayer dollars that are now being allocated to cover the premium cost, these green premiums, as I think even Bill Gates calls it the green premium. But that's essentially what we're doing. We're just shifting burdens from ratepayers who see it on their bill, and they will see it on their bill, as you guys have rightly pointed out, But in addition to that, there's a whole other bucket of funds that are needed to subsidize, and that is funded by society. So, and I just think it's, in the end, if that goes on to any really degree, it's going to disadvantage our economy relative to others.
Let's jump in a little bit into transportation, shall we? Because you wrote a great piece about the ski train, which doesn't everybody love the ski train? Like, but isn't
Yeah.
isn't it worth it? Everybody
Yeah.
wants the ski train.
Yeah. And look, I love the ski train. I happen to live in Winter Park. So, I love the novelty of it. But it is a total splurge. And unfortunately, over the last year, the governor especially has really seemed to have fallen in love with passenger rail. And, to the point where he is suggesting that this will just be an easy decision for people to make, that they'll prefer to ride the train and it'll be more cost effective for their family. And there is such a massive gap for family finances to clear to actually make that choice on a regular basis. And that was the motivation for the op-ed when I, had seen some of his quotes. And so the slide the audience is likely seeing now is really I know it's a lot of numbers on the screen, but is really a summation and a sensitivity and hopefully so you can kind of pick the point where your family might fit on some of these implied costs of a Saturday round trip on the ski train. And again, I love that Winter Park's got it. Like it's a cool marketing tool and it's a fun experience. I mean, but it is an experience and not. I think it's just so far away from being a routine mode of transportation due to its cost. And Amtrak is the operator of this. I have updated these numbers since that op-ed for some of the ticket pricing that they've announced for this ski season. And they're slowly expanding the service. It was run 3 days a week. Last ski season, it's going to be 5 days a week. So tacking on Thursdays and Mondays to this. So it'll be very, very interesting to see how much utilization they get during those more weekday sort of trips. And they've also upped the number of seats that they're going to run this year from 281 last year to I think it's 406 this year. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I've priced out some round trips in January, just taking a Saturday, just because that's when most people are going to be most prone to take this. But you're effectively buying if you're a family of four, the price of that train ticket for your family is like $174. At least in the Saturdays that I priced for January. And they have some surge-based things. So there could be some periods of time where tickets are slightly less. There's some periods of time where they're actually more. Tried to take the middle point here. But you're effectively buying gas for your car. If your family car gets 25 miles to the gallon, you're just saying I'm paying the cost of that ticket is the same as buying gas for almost $30 a gallon. And so most people aren't going to make this choice very often, and I'm not saying
California look affordable.
Yeah, but it's a real stretch to say that families are just going to be indifferent, economically to these two modes of transportation, one being passenger rail and the other being independent mobility from union. So now the one consumer that this may make sense for is if you're a single traveler heading up the mountain by yourself and you drive in a car or a massive truck that gets 10 miles to the gallon. And you can see in that red square, that's effective. Your train ticket as a single user is basically the same as paying $3.07 a gallon. Now, what gets 10 miles to the gallon? Like a Bugatti. That's it. Or a 1979 GMC Suburban. I don't think there's that many consumers that fit that category.
Yeah, or like an old H1 Hummer or something
Yeah,
like that. So not exactly broad economic appeal to this proposition.
Right.
But just to the point of this all is so interconnected, because you mentioned Polis's infatuation with passenger rail. Well, going back to what we kicked the episode off with, he just tacked on a new fee on oil and gas production that's already beleaguered compared to the rest of the country to fund passenger rail expansion that, by the way, as you've shown, doesn't pencil out to begin with anyway. So it goes back to the whole theme of this is subsidization, in this case, taxation or a fee, same thing, of production that's already being hampered to subsidize things that are not effective for either A, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or B, even just pencil out cost-wise. It's a crazy system we've got going on.
We're taking capital, you're in using it to incentivize bad decisions.
Yeah.
And instead of using capital for innovation, technology, for entrepreneurs to do what they do, which is, find more efficient ways to produce or to do something, provide a service. Instead, the state of Colorado does the exact opposite.
Yeah, nationally, the decarbonation that we've seen so far on our power grid, 60% of it has been from switching from coal to natural gas. The other 40% is the addition of wind and solar. So, but our state is particularly hostile to natural gas, and it just doesn't make any sense. The other part of this train analysis is like, well, at what cost? So the premium cost of riding the train versus putting fuel in your gas tank, again, for that family of four, it's over $50,000 a ton of carbon savings. The carbon savings of riding, in a 80% filled diesel train, traveling at 30 miles an hour, up the mountain and back. This is one of the most expensive forms of decarbonization. If that's the most important thing to you, the train doesn't do it. We will bankrupt ourselves if we think that, we can pay this much for decarbonization.
Yeah, I love the point you make, because you compare sort of national research into what decarbonization should cost. And you cite Goldman Sachs, for example, in one of your slides about sub 1,400 a ton is about their estimate for decarbonization. And so comparing that to a policy that pencils out at $50,000 a ton for decarbonization is quite the math there.
And the other thing too is, like, if your car happens to get 30 miles to the gallon, and you're a family of four, the train is more carbon intensive for your family's footprint than it is to drive the car that gets 30 miles to the gallon. That's why there's all those NAs on that lower grid there. Those NAs mean your car is less carbon intensive, at least than the carbon intensity of the Amtrak diesel fleet. So I did it, and I should say that I did an open records request to Amtrak to underpin most of this analysis. And one of the things I asked him was, how much diesel did you burn last year during the ski season on the ski train? And first they said, no, that's a trade secret, we can't tell you. And I pushed back, like, you're not operating some, new locomotive with some engine that we haven't heard of. These are pretty standard, these are standard machines. And then they finally said, well, we just didn't track it, which I also have a hard time believing. So that's a little par for the course, unfortunately, I think, when you have the federal government involved.
As we're coming up close to time here, did you have any last questions for Ryan?
Yeah, I do. I want to, there's a slide in here that I want to get to real quick. And I think it's important because as we've talked about Colorado's poor decisions in the pathway to decarbonization, I think the important thing to recognize is how quality of life and hydrocarbons are interlinked. And real quick, can you just touch on, there's a slide here called Health and Hydrocarbons that I think we should that we should bring up just to let people know that this pathway to decarbonization decarbonization should not necessarily be the goal. In the words of Chris Wright, zero energy poverty versus net zero. And so just touch on health and hydrocarbons real quick.
Yeah, and this is a huge mission for Liberty, and it'll continue even while Chris is on his Washington, D.C. hiatus. And hopefully it'll give it a bigger platform, quite frankly. We're all excited for him in that. But I just think we lose track of how much energy we have access to in this country, at least as, certainly historically, and we do today. In one of the slides here, we almost basically consume almost 20 times the oil per capita that somebody in Africa or India does. It's over 5 times the average person in China. So we really do have huge luxury. Now, the activists will say, well, that is horrible for your health. And the numbers just don't at all bear this out. And so we've shown a stack bar chart that just shows the energy mix. And, this, again, I pointed out the relative quantities of energy that we generally consume relative to the developing world. But just look at it, just forgetting that for a moment, look at the energy mix that we use relative to other places in the world. And it's really hydrocarbon dominated. Obviously, we've not been consuming as much coal. We've substituted that mainly with natural gas. But our mix is really heavily weighted to oil and gas. And yet our health outcomes here that are related to environmental factors, and these are numbers from a University of Washington think tank on global health. And this is borne out by numbers we see from the World Health Organizations too. But we have relatively low mortality rates relative to the rest of the world that are attributed to environmental factors. We have a lot of behavioral stuff, heart disease and all sorts of things that we kind of bring upon ourselves that elevate us, relatively speaking, to some parts of the world. But just in terms of how we think about the environment and in the way it impacts us, we really have great outcomes here. We have some of the best air quality in the world, even though we tend to hear it a lot in Colorado, and we do have ozone issues. Much of that's imported from outside our borders. We can't do a lot to prevent that, and yet certain sectors of our economy have certainly been asked to cut really massive amounts. And again, for what benefit when we're getting so much of it, blown our way, So again, this is a really important thing for us to communicate and have people just recognize a little bit more, because what you're fed through the media and such is, you don't really get the real facts.
No, I think it can't be overstated enough, the fact that we're energy abundant. We can have energy abundance and positive public health outcomes. And in fact, those things are quite linked. Most people will find.
Yeah, the thing that the easy stat, I think, is that there's about 2.1 billion people today around the world that still burn wood and dung and charcoal to heat and cook their food every day of the year. And we love that for a weekend, effectively, when we go camping here in the state. But we can't wait to get home Sunday night and wash that off, right? And but that, the fact that there are people over those, what we know as campfires, to that degree is killing 3 million people a year, and that's a World Health Organization number. And so that's a really tragic sort of outcome that we don't pay much attention to, and why we arrive at the goal that, hey, we want to get people out of energy poverty, which access is certainly a huge part of that. And when you don't have access to modern fuels, you're going to burn whatever you can find within walking distance, and that's what's happening with 2.1 billion people today.
Absolutely. Amy, did you have any takeaways for our audience?
I do, and I want to thank Ryan for providing these for me. And by the way, we'll drop Liberty's email or their web address in the show notes so that everybody can check them out, and as well as link to the Bettering Human Lives. But number one, this struck me as Colorado faces a $1 billion budget shortfall, that we are missing $18 billion potentially. $18 billion in lost revenue because of attacks on oil and gas producers. I just want you to wrap your mind around that. There would be no budget shortfall if we didn't have this war on oil and gas producers in the state of Colorado. And then two, Colorado's choice, its path to decarbonize, will bankrupt the state. And I'm going to throw this out there so that you don't have to say it, but it could actually kill people. People could die from this because of the choice the state of Colorado is making to decarbonize. It's leading to bankruptcy and probably unreliability. And for that, you would be wise to invest in a generator.
Sage advice as always. Ryan, we want to thank you again for joining us this episode. If you like what you saw here, you can head on over to PowerGab.org to check out our entire back catalog. We produce new episodes every single week. We're also available wherever you get your audio shows, whether that's Spotify or Apple. And if you want to reach out to us to suggest future show topics or other great guests that you'd like to see us interview, you can send those over to info@powergab.org. We love to hear from you guys. But until next week, we'll see you.